Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Pesachim daf Samach Tet. With a lot of dedications today. This week's learning is sponsored by Paul and Danielle Nakamuli in honor of Danielle's daughter, Ayelet Yancey's bat mitzvah. We're so proud of you and can't wait to see where your Jewish journey takes you. Love, Paul and Ima. Today's daf is also sponsored by Gabrielle Altman in honor of the Yurtzites of the Honorable Miriam Altman, Naomi Rosen, and the Shloshim of Aviva Rolnick, beloved, cherished, and treasured family and friends, whom I will always miss and hold forever in my heart. And by Rachel Gabal in honor of her sister, Ellen Werlin. I'm so honored to be learning Daf Yomi with you and alongside you and your daughter, Avigail. You're an inspiring duo. I can't wait to see what the next year of Dafim holds in store. Happy birthday. And by the Haight family for Refuah Shlema for Rabbi Joel Cohen, Harav Yoel HaKohen Ben Dina. Okay, we're going to start at the bottom. We have to just remember the Mishnah. We're dealing with this Mishnah that came up on Samachay Amud Bet, about the list of items that override Shabbat and the ones that of actions that override Shabbat for the purpose of the Korban Pesach, and all the ones that don't. Anything Rabbi Akiva says it could, or also Rabbi Yeshua, that could have been done before Shabbat, you cannot do on Shabbat, even if they're only derabanan in nature. To which Rabbi Eliezer disagreed and said, "What do you mean? Of course you can." And this matches what he said in the parak of Rabbi Eliezer de Mila in Shabbat. We're also machshirei milah, bringing the knife, let's say, to the brit milah, that he says is dochesh Shabbat. It's the same exact Rabbi Eliezer, the same opinion, the same approach. And then there was a whole back and forth in the Mishnah, which we said was a bit atypical for the Mishnah. Here we're going to see not only is it atypical for the Mishnah, but besides that, we're going to see lots of other, there was a lot of discussion here, a lot of other braytot about discussions that ensue between the two of them. And we're going to go through a bunch of the different parts of their argument. So the first part of the argument, Rabbi Eliezer had said, isn't it just logical if shchita, right, which is usher by Torah law, overrides Shabbat, wouldn't you say all the more so that that the derabanans, right, like carrying outside the tchum, would override Shabbat? To which Rabbi Yeshua said, we're going to prove it from Yom Tov. Yom Tov, we allow deoraitas, but not derabanans that you could have done yesterday, right? That you could have brought the food from, you can't bring the food from outside the tchum on Yom Tov. That's not allowed. To which Rabbi Eliezer said, you're proving to me reshut to mitzvah? What do you mean? Just because you don't allow it on Yom Tov doesn't mean you wouldn't allow it on Shabbat. So that's where we're going to start with Rav Ashi. Amar Rav Ashi, which we discussed yesterday, right? There's a machloket, is eating a mitzvah on, is it a mitzvah or not, right? Rabbi Eliezer obviously thought it wasn't a mitzvah because you could do kulo la Hashem like we saw yesterday. So 3 lines from the bottom of Samachet Amud Bet. Amar Rav Ashi. Ulamaita ka'amar Rabbi Eliezer nami Yom Tov reshut itle pircha. The fact that he says Yom Tov is reshut, and therefore don't try to prove to me from Yom Tov, you could also knock that out. How so? Ma Yom Tov shitir bo malacha shel reshut lo hitir shvut she'ima. Shabbat shelo hitir ba'el malacha shel mitzvah ein odin shelo tatir shvut she'ima. Just because on Yom Tov they didn't allow it, that's because it's reshut. When it comes to a mitzvah, or right, when it comes to a mitzvah, shelo hitir ba'el malacha shel mitzvah ein odin shelo tatir ba shvut she'ima. Right, when Yom Tov they only allowed Melacha reshut, and yet, right, they still didn't, when it's a mitzvah, and they didn't even allow derabanan, Shabbat, which they didn't, lo itir ba'ela, they only allowed. Shabbat is more limited. Why? Shabbat, they only allowed shvut of a mitzvah. So all the more so, we shouldn't allow, right? Shabbat didn't allow anything of reshut. And it's Yantif allowed reshut. They allowed you to do, right, for the purposes of just regular eating, and yet they limited you only to doraita. So in Shabbat, when they don't even allow things of reshut, right, what do? They allowed only melachav mitzvah. So if that's the case, they're already more limiting. So all the more so, they're going to be limiting and not permit derabanan. So that could have been a claim we could have used against Rabbi Eliezer. So then they say, why did Rabbi Eliezer not say that? Because Rabbi Eliezer, shvut mitzvah adifle. He thinks a mitzvah is more important. In other words, he thinks, again, for a mitzvah will allow anything. So that's why it's not really a good claim against him, or it's a claim he could have argued against. Tanya. Now we bring a bright. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Umali, okay, it'll be very helpful if you follow along in the sheet because it's quite a complicated daf in terms of the flow. So I tried to organize it so that you can see what we're up to. And I'll try to, as I teach, I'll also kind of keep keep going back so that we keep it in order. So now we bring again another Braita. Like I said in the beginning, we're going to have more Braita with more discussions between the two. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, umali im dachu machshirei mitzvah shelachar shchitat haShabbat, ditavad lemitzvah, lo yitchu machshirei mitzvah shelifnei shchitat haShabbat. Which things were allowed in the Mishnah? Remember, shchita, zrika. Okay, those are the main parts of the korban. And then we even allowed you to clean out the insides and sacrifice the parts on the altar that really could wait till tomorrow, and also are not critical parts of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is already done. When you're finished with zrika, you're basically finished with the mitzvah. Yes, you have some things to finish up, but the main parts are finished. Now, think about it. If you're going to permit something when it comes to a mitzvah, what are you going to permit? You're going to permit what is necessary to fulfill the mitzvah. At this point, you finish fulfilling the mitzvah. So what are we going to say here? If that's the case, then if we allow things, once the mitzvah is finished, wouldn't you think it would be logical to permit things in order to do the mitzvah? Like bringing the animal from outside the tchum? It's much more logical that if we're going to permit something, we're going to permit what enables you to do the mitzvah, and not once you're already finished with the mitzvah and enables you to do some extra things that aren't critical to the mitzvah. So the fact that we allow that category must mean that we should also allow the original, right? The earlier category. So Amar Rabbi Akiva, what's Rabbi Akiva's answer? He's going to give two answers to this claim. Dimalim dachu machshirei mitzvah shelachar shchitat haShabbat, sharei dachata shchitat haShabbat. Tomar yidchu machshirei mitzvah shelifnei shchitat haShabbat, shelo dachata shchitat haShabbat. He says, wait a minute. What you're saying makes no sense because you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. What enables us to do all the stuff after the sacrifice? The fact that we already pushed Shabbat aside for this mitzvah. In other words, what happens? And this is an interesting perspective. We didn't talk about this really yet, but Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor is the same thing. When you say Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, when the majority of the community is Tameh, we can push off, right, the issue of Tumah. It's an irrelevant point. Yeah. The wording is hutra, but it also comes up dechuya. Is it dechuya, like we just ignore everything? It's as if we've overridden it and there's no issue whatsoever? Or is it just hutra? Is it just permitted, which means we still have to look and check and make sure everything else is in check? Or do we say kind of everything's just pushed off? So when it comes to Shabbat and you slaughter the animal and you do the zrika and all that's forbidden by Torah law, but yet we push Shabbat aside, Shabbat has been pushed aside for this mitzvah. At this point, anything you do after, like Shabbat's been pushed aside for this sacrifice. So we've already moved Shabbat kind of to the side and said, listen, when it comes to this korban, we ignore the fact that it's Shabbat. So you could do everything you need for the korban, even if it's not critical. But that's not true before you slaughter the animal. When does the Shabbat get pushed off? When you start slaughtering the animal. So anything before, Shabbat's not yet pushed aside. So that's one reason he gives. The second reason, davar acher, shema yimatzeh zevach pasul v'nimtza mechalel et haShabbat lemafreya. Maybe you'll find that maybe you'll go to sacrifice the animal and you'll find maybe the animal has a blemish, or you'll slaughter it and you'll mess up the slaughtering, or something could happen along the way. Someone will think lo lishma, and you'll mess up the korban. So therefore, when will we allow you to override Shabbat? Once the korban's finished, then these other things, you can still do them because your korban went through perfectly. But before, when you're just bringing the animal, you don't even know. It's like a good example, right? You don't know. Let's say, I'll give you a relevant example for this. Let's say a doctor gets a call, someone's, on their, very sick. They might die, but, come help. You maybe could save their lives. And what happens if the doctor gets there and the person's already dead? So he was mechalel Shabbat for no reason, right? So obviously, right, we allow this because maybe he'd be able to save him. But in the end, he might not even get there in time, and it would end up, right, retroactively that he had been mechalel Shabbat, that's crazy, Shabbat for no reason. So it's the same thing here, that maybe we're not going to allow you to bring the animal because maybe this animal won't even go through in the end. There'll be some problem along the way. And then it turns out you'll have desecrated Shabbat for no reason. Once you've done the shchita and the zrika, then we'll allow some other things because we know the sacrifice went through. Well, the second claim obviously is going to have some problems because they're going to reject this and say, Yihachi, if that's the case, mishchat nami lo nishchat, shema yimatzeh zevach pasul v'nimtza mechalel et haShabbat lemafreya. Well, then you shouldn't even be allowed to slaughter the animal because you could still mess up the sacrifice after that, or even the slaughtering itself. Maybe you'll mess up the shchita. So then you shouldn't allow anything for this reason. Maybe it'll be disqualified. So therefore, and we all know that you do, so therefore, Ella, what happened here with these two claims of Rabbi Akiva? This is something similar to what we said the other day. Ella ha'amar le beresha uparche. He really said the second claim first, and Rabbi Eliezer rejected it, even though it doesn't say so in the Braita. It's just that it's obvious you can reject that claim because then you wouldn't allow shchita at all. And Hadar amar lehach dimali imdachu. And then he went back and said the first answer. So in other words, we had it as 1, 2. It really was 2 came first. Rabbi Eliezer rejected it, and that's why he brought answer number 1 that appears as number 1 by us, but was really answer number 2. It also explains why there were 2 points that Rabbi Akiva made, because 1 got rejected. Okay, moving on. Now we have this problem that was a little bit confusing in the Mishnah, and I already kind of told you a little bit about what was going to be in today's daf at the time, because it's hard to explain the Mishnah without it, which is Rabbi Akiva comes along and says that that haza'ah, right? I'm going to prove my point, because if someone's standing on the 7th day of having been a Tmei Met on Yudalid, we do not allow them to sprinkle the water, the purification waters on this person. Okay, and that's a machshirei mitzvah. It enables him to do the mitzvah, and yet we don't allow it. So what do we say? Here you see, all these things don't override Shabbat. To which Rabbi Eliezer said, what do you mean? I disagree with you about this. I think you can sprinkle the purification waters. To which Rabbi Akiva responded something very weird. It comes at the top of Samach Vav Amud Aleph. Amar le Rabbi Akiva, ochiluf. I'll take what you said and I'll reverse it. The logic that you were using, I'll reverse your logic, and I'll tell you something that's going to come out absurd from what you're saying, even though it's not really from what he's saying, because he says, he starts off with, against Rabbi Eliezer, that haza'ah. Rabbi Eliezer said, sprinkling the water overrides Shabbat. And Rabbi Akiva says, Mayim haza'ashi mishum shvut eina dochet Shabbat. He just repeats his claim that I don't think the sprinkling overrides Shabbat. And since it doesn't override Shabbat, if that doesn't override Shabbat, we're going to take your logic and say, well, then shchita shouldn't override Shabbat. And we know that's not the case, right? To which Rabbi Eliezer gets very angry at him and says, and we'll see in today's daf, he gets even more angry than appears in our Mishnah. And he says, Akiva, akarta masha katuv b'Torah. What you're saying is so absurd, and you can't possibly even suggest such a thing because you're overriding something that says explicitly in the Torah, because it says b'moado, you do it in its proper time. Even if it's on Shabbat, you obviously slaughter it on Shabbat. So there's a few weird things here, right? The real difficult thing is why did Rabbi Akiva respond to Rabbi Eliezer, who said haza'ah overrides Shabbat, by saying haza'ah doesn't override Shabbat, and then making a logical conclusion based on Rabbi Eliezer's logic, saying, I'm going to come to an absurd conclusion. So we have a few things to explain here. We'll get to them as we go on. So Tanya, here's a version of the Braita, as I said, with a more harsh response of Rabbi Eliezer. Very harsh, you would say. Tanya. So the Braita says like this. Amar li Rabbi Eliezer, Akiva, b'shchita heshivtani, b'shchita tehei mitato. Whoa. First of all, he talks about him in the third person. I guess he doesn't want to say this directly, but what he says is, you responded to me with some ridiculous, preposterous thing about shchita. You're going to be slaughtered. Your death is going to be a death through slaughtering, which is interesting because Rabbi Akiva doesn't exactly get slaughtered, but we know, right, his skin gets combed by the Romans, right, by these hot combs, and he gets killed in a very, very cruel manner. And maybe it's because of this curse that Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus puts upon him. Okay, he says, you're so chutzpahdik with your chutzpahdik question, you're going to end up right. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, we know from the Tanur Shalachnai story, he's very strong in his opinions. And here you see, right, he went a little bit far, maybe too far, and cursed him from it. And we'll see even why it's even the worse that he cursed him, because in fact, it seems like Rabbi Eliezer was incorrect in this whole story. Amarlo. So Rabbi Akiva's response in this Braita is, Al tachpereni b'shat hadin. Don't start, telling me, I'm going to be judged for this. Kach mekublani mimcha. I learned this directly from you. What did I learn directly from you? And now we see why he repeats his claim, even though it goes against Rabbi Eliezer. He's trying to remind Rabbi Eliezer what he said. Now, he didn't want to say this directly before, but now he says it. You taught me, haza'ah shvuti. Haza'ah is a shvut. It's a derabanan. Ve'ina dochet Shabbat, and it doesn't override Shabbat. You can't sprinkle the waters on Shabbat. So here he says, right, you basically taught us this. So I don't know why you're disagreeing. And that's why he repeats himself to remind Rabbi Eliezer what he originally taught him. So now we have to try to understand Rabbi Eliezer. If Rabbi Eliezer taught this to Rabbi Akiva, why is he changing his tone on it? Why does he now say it's not the case? That he thinks haza'ah does override Shabbat. So we're going to have two explanations. We're going to have Ula, which in the end the Gemara is going to reject, and then we're going to bring another explanation. Amar Ula, Rabbi Eliezer ki agmare, haza'ah de truma agmare, de truma gufa lo dachya Shabbat. When Rabbi Eliezer taught it, he didn't teach it about this. He didn't teach haza'ah of its meimet in order to allow him to do the Korban Pesach. That he doesn't think overrides Shabbat. He taught it about sprinkling the waters to enable a kohen to eat truma. That overrides that, right? So that's where he says it doesn't override Shabbat. In other words, I think I might have said that reverse right now. Let me just clarify. I don't remember what I said a second ago, but Rabbi Eliezer, when it comes to haza'ah, okay, in our context, for the Korban Pesach, he will allow it. But when it comes to truma, just to allow a kohen to eat truma, he won't allow it. Okay, so what happened? Rabbi Eliezer taught it about truma. So now let's go through the discussion according to this. So Rabbi Akiva, nami ki otve, haza'ah de truma otve. It's not that Rabbi Akiva misunderstood Rabbi Eliezer. He knew what Rabbi Eliezer said. When he responded to him, but you, right, well, he didn't say you said, but he was trying to remind him that you said that haza'ah does not override Shabbat. He meant haza'ah, to sprinkle waters to make someone pure so that they could eat truma. You said that doesn't override Shabbat. Now, why is he making this comparison? They're two different things, but they're not so different. Why are they kind of the same? If you think that the sprinkling, in order to allow one to eat truma, doesn't override Shabbat, let's put it into a category. What's that category? Shehi mitzvah vihi mishum shvut. It's a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is to eat truma. Okay, this is very interesting, and you spend a whole shiur on this, but I'll just mention it very briefly. From here, they derive that it's a mitzvah to eat truma. You might not have thought that. It's a mitzvah to separate the truma and give it to the kohen, but then the kohen, like he's eating his regular food, his food is truma, but apparently it's a mitzvah. The Rambam says you would make a bracha. When you eat truma, you make a special bracha. Maybe it's alachilat truma. I don't remember the wording, but I found it in the Rambam. He says you make a bracha on eating truma. And the source that truma is a mitzvah is our Gemara. Okay? They get it from here, that there must be a mitzvah about eating truma, and they connect it to a pasuk. Okay, again, like I said, I'm not going to get into all the details, but there's a whole issue about this. So anyway, he says, here you have, it's a mitzvah to eat truma, and yet we don't allow you to sprinkle the waters on the purification waters to allow on Shabbat to enable someone to do the mitzvah of eating truma, and therefore you shouldn't allow it for the Pesach either. That's Rabbi Akiva's claim. So now what happened? This is what you call classic miscommunication. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva quotes Rabbi Eliezer perfectly. He just didn't say sprinkling for truma, but that's what he meant. He knew that Rabbi Eliezer only said it by sprinkling of truma, but what he was trying to say is this is no different. To which Rabbi Eliezer hears him say, now he didn't say you said it, but he was saying this is the halacha, that it doesn't override Shabbat. V'hu saval, when he heard him say this, when Rabbi Eliezer heard this, he said, haza'ah de Pesach kamotivle. He thought that he was responding regarding haza'ah and Pesach. And to that, right, even Rabbi Akiva didn't think that Rabbi Eliezer said that, but he was trying to just make a connection. And yes, I see in the chat someone saying, it's not exactly the same. And it's true, it's not the same. One is a mitzvah that will pass and one is a mitzvah that won't pass. But still, in other words, again, Rabbi Eliezer is talking in concepts here. Mitzvah, reshut, right? So he's trying to knock out his claim and say, here's an issue for a mitzvah, and we don't let it override. So he thought he was talking about Pesach, and therefore he got upset with him, and he said, there's no such thing as a Pesach does override Shabbat. Okay, so anyway, that's what he says. Mativ Rabba doesn't, and then the whole issue here, according to Ula, is that there was a total miscommunication between the two. Rabbi Akiva was quoting Rabbi Eliezer when it came to Truma, and Rabbi Eliezer thought he was talking about Pesach, and he basically says that's totally not true, and you're talking, nonsense, because he didn't understand him. Okay, this is classic. You have to listen, or if you're not sure, ask. Anyway, that's his reading. Rabba doesn't like this reading. Mativ Rabba. He questions it like this, and he said, but look at the upcoming, I'm going to quote your Braita, where it's clear that he was talking about haza'ah, sprinkling for the Korban Pesach. And here it says it explicitly. So you can't claim that based on this version of this Braita. Hishiv Rabbi Akiva v'amar. Rabbi Akiva responds and says, haza'at tmeimet tochiach. The sprinkling of a tmeimet will prove it. Shechal shvi ishalo liyopa shabbat be'erev haPesach. Here's exactly our case. He's on the seventh day. It's Erev Pesach. And obviously, what's he doing the sprinkling for? For the Korban Pesach, not for eating Truma. Shehi mitzvah, v'hi mishum shvut. It's a mitzvah and it's shvut. Ve'ina dochet Shabbat, and it doesn't override Shabbat. So this version clearly knocks out Ula. Obviously, Ula didn't have this braita, but Rabbi had this braita and says basically you can't say that. Ela vaday haza'ah de Pesach Agmari. For sure, he was talking about haza'ah of Pesach, okay, and not haza'ah of Truma. So now, back to the original question. So sometimes they don't repeat the question, but now they're repeating the question in case you didn't remember what we were up to. So if that's the case, we'll answer it in one way. Now we have to come up with a different answer to this question. If Rabbi Eliezer really taught that, then why did he change his mind? And now all of a sudden he doesn't think that anymore. So Rabbi Eliezer gamre it akarle. He obviously forgot what he had said. Okay, it happens sometimes, right? So it's interesting. According to Ula, the whole issue is that they're both very common things. One is someone misinterprets what someone else is saying, right? You don't listen properly. And according to this, somebody's forgetful, right? We all know that. Sometimes you forget something that you yourself said. And Rabbi Akiva is trying to refresh his memory. And that's where Rabbi Akiva repeats what he said about it doesn't override Shabbat, because he was figured if he keeps saying it over and over, maybe it'll jar Rabbi Eliezer's memory. Also something that we know, right? If somebody says something, it might jar your memory and remind you. So why didn't he just say so explicitly? Savar lav orech ara. He says it's just not an appropriate manner to speak that way to your rabbi. Now, I told you this when we learned it in the Mishnah, right? That Abaye always says this to Rabbi Yosef, but you're the one who taught us. So some people speak in that way, but right, in this case, he didn't. He tried to do it in a much more gentle way, and look what happened, right? He gets cursed in the end for it, and he didn't. It's almost interesting. It's kind of saying maybe even though there's this issue of respect for your rabbi, sometimes you're better off saying things explicitly, because look what happened in the end. Rabbi Eliezer misunderstood, right? Rabbi Eliezer basically didn't get the hint and got very angry at him and cursed him. So now we have to go back to, now we have a more basic question. Haza'ah my time alodache Shabbat. Why does haza'ah not override Shabbat? So again, we have, right? I see what Caroline, it's a good suggestion. Maybe he was trying to be careful because he knew Rabbi Eliezer had a bad temper, right? In the end, it came back to haunt him. Didn't work, but maybe also that's why he was being more cautious. It could be Rabbi Yosef, first of all, forgot a lot of his Torah in the end of his life and probably was conscious of the fact that he had forgotten a lot of his Torah. So it wasn't a big insult to say so, right? He knew that that was the case. In this case, maybe it was a one-off and he forgot it. And it was, he didn't want to exactly say it explicitly. So in any case, he did it in this way, although it really wasn't so successful. But now we have to understand, really, so according to this, Rabbi Akiva thinks haza'ah is not tochesh Shabbat. Even Rabbi Eliezer apparently thought so. He just didn't remember that he said so. So why? Why is it not tochesh Shabbat? What's the problem with haza'ah? Michti tiltule ba'almahu titche Shabbat mishum Pesach. If it's really only the issue of muktzah, okay, now why is it muktzah? What's muktzah? Something that has no purpose. So this water, it's true, it purifies you, but it in and of itself is just water. It's not water that you drink, so it's not a food or drink. It's not a utensil that you can use for something. So it theoretically is something that you use that is useful only to do something that you can't do on Shabbat. So basically what they're saying is, why wouldn't it be docha Shabbat? It's only muktzah, and that's pretty light. We should be able to override this. So what do they say? Amar Rabba, gzeram shema yetzlena v'yavirena arba amot be'reshut harabim. So what does he say? Oh, the issue is, okay, and you might realize this falls into a very famous category of items called gzera de Rabba. Rabba himself says when it comes to shofar, lulav, and megillah, okay, all these happening on holidays, if they fall on Shabbat, you're not allowed to do the mitzvah. This is why we don't blow shofar on Shabbat. We don't take a lulav on Shabbat. Both of those happened this year. And we don't read Megillah on Shabbat either. Why don't we do these? Because these are all things, Rabba says, we're worried that if these have implements involved, and if you forget them, you might have to end up carrying them, so you don't do it when they fall out on Shabbat. Now, people all try to make theories about what's the unique about these three things and why. It's interesting because all the theories don't include this one, but this is also a Gzera de Rabba. He says the reason here fits in with his animamin, his belief in these other areas, that there's a concern that you'll carry this sprinkling water, these waters, purification waters, for cubits in Reshut Harabim, and that will be the problem. So there we get to a possible issue of a deoraita. Okay, it's only a derabbanan. Maybe you will, but maybe you'll transgress a deoraita. So now, Now they say, even according to you, Rabbi Eliezer, Neabre, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it shouldn't even be a problem to carry a 4 Amud and Rishud Rabim. Why is that? Daha Amar Rabbi Eliezer, it's his famous Shita, Machshirei Mitzvah Dochim et Shabbat. He thinks anything for preparation for a mitzvah overrides Shabbat. So what if you carry it 4 Amud and Rishud Rabim? It's enabling you to do a mitzvah, to bring the Korban Pesach, so it should be fine. Amre, so what's the reason? Okay, we're now going to have one reason. We're going to get into depth into this. We're going to eventually reject it, and then we're going to go to a second reason. Okay, so again, like I said, you got to keep the structure in mind. Our question now is, why, if Rabbi Eliezer thinks that all Machshirei Mitzvah Dochim et Shabbat, why would he think, and as the Rabbi Akiva quoted him as saying, that the sprinkling waters don't override Shabbat in order to do the Korban Pesach? So he says something very interesting, this theory. Amre, it's only when does something override Shabbat? When the person can do the mitzvah, okay? When a person is chayav in the mitzvah because of their status right now, they have an obligation in the mitzvah, that's when we allow anything to do to override Shabbat in order to do the mitzvah. But in our case, we have a person who's tamei meit. He can't do the mitzvah of Pesach right now. If he stays in this status, he can't. So right now, he doesn't have a chiyuv on him for Korban Pesach because he's a tamei meit. So therefore, we don't allow overriding of a mitzvah in order to enable him to do a mitzvah because it's not a mitzvah that's on him right now because he can't do the mitzvah right now, right? Normally, what would happen? He'd be pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So he doesn't have a mitzvah upon him right now. So what he says is this fascinating line, the Gemara says, if someone is not ra'oi to do a mitzvah, in other words, the mitzvah for some reason is not relevant, there's some barrier between him and the mitzvah, then that person can't override Shabbat for anything. So now we're going to question this. I'm a rabbi. Well, first, actually, before we question, we're going to come to a certain rabbi is going to say, one can conclude from here, la halacha, the following. L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer. According to this then, okay, so let's go back to our machshirei milah case. So you can do anything for Brit Milah. Brit Milah overrides Shabbat. So you can override Shabbat for the purposes of Brit Milah. Now, one thing they did with babies before the Brit Milah, they would warm them in a hot bath. Okay, and that would kind of get them ready for the Brit Milah. Without that, they wouldn't do a Brit Milah, it seems. So what does he say? Katam bari, if you have a healthy baby, you can warm up water for him to lahavroto, to kind of prepare him for the Brit Milah and give him the Brit Milah on Shabbat, because a katan that's bari is healthy, he's allowed to do a Brit Milah. But dehachazele, because he's ra'oi, so you can override Shabbat. But a katan chole, if a katan is sick, you can't warm up water in order to get him, let's say he's a little bit sick, needs warming. Once you warm him, he'll be able to do the Brit Milah. We'll be able to do the Brit Milah on him. That's not allowed because right now he's not ra'oi. So it comes out this weird thing. If the chatan is healthy, you can warm the water, which isn't really necessary, right? So in a minute, we're going to say that. But so I'm a rabbi. Wait a minute. If he's perfectly healthy and you could do the Brit Milah without the water, then how can we let you warm the water? Because you don't really need the water to do the mitzvah. So Ela Amarava, he says no. It's actually viewed a little bit differently. Everyone's considered sick when it comes to a Brit Milah, meaning every child, every infant is not really ready for the Brit Milah until you warm up this water and bathe them in the water. Which means all infants are not ra'oi for Brit Milah on Shabbat, only if you bathe them. Therefore, you can't bathe them. You can't warm the water to bathe them. The issue is warming the water, not bathing them. So therefore, what do you have to do? You have to warm the water before Shabbat. You can only use water that was warmed before Shabbat. If you didn't warm the water, then the baby's not chayav in Brit Milah, basically, because there's a barrier between him and Brit Milah, and then you can't override Shabbat for that baby. Some people say, so then why don't we just create a situation where you don't warm the water, then the baby's not chayav on Shabbat, because why should we override Shabbat if we don't have to, right? This whole, you can get off at all sorts of things about this, but I'm not going to go there right now. Okay, so now, basically, he basically questions this whole thing, right? He says, right, this halacha that you said, I don't think is really a halacha for me. But now we have a question on this theory. This theory says if you're not ra'oi, you can't be mechalel, right? If you're not ra'oi, let's say you're a tameh, you're standing on seventh day, you're actually not obligated in Korban Pesach, right? Because you're not ra'oi. So therefore, you can't be doche Shabbat because you're not ra'oi. So now Abba is going to bring up a question on this. Arel shalomal anush karek divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer himself, we were trying to explain Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer himself says, if you're an Arel, you didn't get circumcised yet, and you don't circumcise, you could theoretically, we're talking about someone who could circumcise himself. You don't get circumcised on Erev Pesach, and you don't do the Korban Pesach, you get karet, because you basically did not, you could have done the Korban Pesach by circumcising yourself, and you didn't, so you get karet. So now, what did we say? The Tamei person who needs to sprinkle himself day number 7, but it's Shabbat, so he can't do it. Why can't he do it? Because he's not actually obligated in Korban Pesach, because he's exempt right now, because he falls into one of the exempt categories. Likewise, the Arel. The Arel is not ra'oi right now to do a Korban Pesach, so why is he getting karet for not doing it? So, Alma Rame Chiyuve Aleh. Right? So from the fact that he's anush karet, it shows he is obligated. Just because there's some barrier between him and the mitzvah doesn't mean he's not obligated. He is obligated. So Amar Rabba, Kasava Rabbi Eliezer. So in order to answer this question, Rabba says Arel is different from Tamei. It's a little bit complicated till we get to his answer. He's going to say there's 3 things. Okay, we don't exactly get where he says this, but he says Rabbi Eliezer must hold the following 3 things. In which case, once we explain these 3 things, we're going to see that Arel is different from Tamei. And that's why Arel gets karet, but a Tamei, theoretically, we're going to say, wouldn't really get karet because right now he doesn't have an obligation upon him. Okay, and that's why you can't, they're both connected. If he's not obligated, if he's not going to get karet for not doing the Korban Pesach, it means because he's not obligated right now, he's exempt, which means that he doesn't, that you're not allowed to desecrate Shabbat to get him to the stage where he can actually do the mitzvah. So Rabbi says, Kasava Rabbi Eliezer must hold number 1. What does this mean? This means that if you're a Tamei Sheretz and you're standing on the 14th, we already explained that if normally a Tamei Sheretz, what does he do? He goes to the mikveh in the morning, and then let's say, so it's later on your Dalit, you can slaughter the Korban Pesach for him, even though he has to wait till nighttime to be tahol. Remember, you have to wait till sunset or till Seder Kochavim, really, night the stars come out. But at that point, what happens? You can slaughter the Korban Pesach for him, because he doesn't have to eat it till nighttime anyway, and it's only eating that's the issue right now. What if he didn't go to the mikveh? But theoretically, he could go to the mikveh anytime today and become tahol. So they say, according to what Rabbi says, Rabbi Eliezer holds, you don't slaughter a Korban Pesach if he hasn't yet gone to the mikveh. Okay? He's not included in this. Okay, we'll get to why this is relevant soon. V'kol, number 2, kol she'ilu b'yachid nidche. If an individual would be pushed off to Pesach Sheni for whatever issue it is, in other words, if it's an issue that would allow the individual to do the Pesach Sheni, then B'tzibur Avdei B'tuma. Then the community is able to then do it. If the whole community had that same issue, they would be allowed to do it as a community without having to go through a purification process, right? This is Tuma Hutra B'tzibur. V'chol milta, number 3, anything to ita b'tzibur, ita b'yachid. Anything that applies to the tzibur applies to the individual. We're going to see in a minute what this means. It's a little hard to understand yet. It's a little up in the air. The kol milta de leita b'tzibur, and anything that tzibur is not required to do, leita b'yachid, the individual is not required to do. So this is what he establishes. Now, what's the relevance of all this? He says, arelut, so let's take examples. Arelut. De'i kuli tzibur arelim ninu. Now we'll understand what that last line meant. If the whole community were uncircumcised, Erev Pesach, what would we do? We'd say we're doing a massive circumcision for everybody, and we do the Pesach. You wouldn't say, oh, we're going to allow uncircumcised people to bring the Korban Pesach because the whole tzibur is tamei. No, we don't do that. So therefore, and that's also connected with anything that Yachid Nidche Pesach Sheni, which is not Arel, right, isn't something that the tzibur does, right? I was going to say this also, right? Alana points out in Sefer Yoshua, remember there was this big, massive circumcision done right before the Korban Pesach. So they really get it from there. Okay, so now, Nami Amrinan Lahu Kum Mahov Avi Pischa. So therefore, for the Yachid, when Yachid is standing an individual on Erev Pesach and he's uncircumcised, what do we say to him? So now this is whatever we tell the tzibur to do, we tell the individual. If we tell the whole community, go get circumcised so that we can bring the Korban Pesach, we're going to also tell the individual, go get circumcised. That's why the Arel gets karet if he doesn't do that. The Ilomayo va'avid anush karet. Okay, so if he doesn't do it, it's going to get karet. But Tuma, de'i kule tzibur tmeim ninhu lo medina nalai. What if the majority of the community is tmeim? What do we say? You don't have to purify themselves. We don't say everybody go purify themselves. What do we say? Tum'ah hutra b'tzibur. everyone can come to Me'im into the temple, no problem. There's a big exemption. Therefore, now let's take it to our individual. Yachid nami patur. Therefore, our individual is also exempt. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. We said ain't shochatim for this person. So because ain't shochatim, what does that teach us? If you don't slaughter for someone who hasn't gone to the mikveh yet, who's tamei on day number 7, it means they're pushed off to Pesach Sheni. If they're pushed off to Pesach Sheni, that means it's something that the community wouldn't, right? Anything that an individual gets pushed off to Pesach Sheni, the community can do Pesach Rishon, Betuma. If they could do Betuma, they don't need to purify themselves on Erev Pesach. Therefore, he doesn't need to purify himself on Erev Pesach to be Ra'oi to bring the Korban Pesach. And therefore, he doesn't get karet. And therefore, he's different from the Arel. So this was all to explain why that Arel source is not a question on the theory that if you're not Ra'oi, right? If you are Ra'oi, then if you're not Ra'oi, like you might have thought the Arel is not Ra'oi, why does he get karet? That's because this is different. It's not the same kind of Ra'oi. Okay, they're different. So that's what Rabba answers. But now we're going to have 2 questions on this. The first one we'll answer. The second one we're not going to answer. And we're not going to have an answer, and therefore we're going to have to bring a different explanation. We're going to reject that whole theory that if you're not Ra'oi, you don't have to bring the Korban Pesach, okay? Which means then if you're not Ra'oi, we're not going to be able to override Shabbat for you. So Amalei Rav Huna B'Reit Rav Yoshua LeRabba. First question. First of all, you say anything that ain't b'tzibur, ain't b'yachid. Well, here's a thing that isn't b'tzibur, but is b'yachid. What is that? Hare Pesach Sheni, the whole concept of Pesach Sheni, leite b'tzibur. The whole community can't go bring Pesach Sheni. It's only for individuals. Ish. V'ite b'yachid, and yet it is by individuals. So Amalei, he says, that's not a question. Shanei hatam da'avid le'tzibura b'rishon. The tzibur did it, and Pesach Sheni is just is an outgrowth of Pesach Rishon. It means the tzibur did it in Pesach Rishon, so therefore the individual could do it at Pesach Sheni. This makes it sound like, by the way, if there were a year where everyone was tamei, or everyone was tamei, let's say they were all zavim and mitzoraim and yoldod and nidod and all that, and they didn't, who is not allowed to do it betuma, and they didn't do Pesach Rishon, sounds like individuals that year would not do Pesach Sheni. Okay, that's what it seems to be indicating. Okay, fine, we answered the first question, but now we have a second question that we're not going to be able to answer. Meitive. Now we're going to bring another source that seems to disagree. Now, the pasuk, when it talks about who gets karet, it says, when it talked about Pesach Sheni, these people are put off to Pesach Sheni. And then it said, an isha sheru tahol, if you are pure on Pesach Rishon, ubederach loaya, and he wasn't far away from the temple, v'chadal asot Pesach, and he didn't do the Korban Pesach, this is Bamidbar Tet Yud Gimel, v'nichrta nefesh yimei, he gets cut off, karet. So, what did they say here? You might have thought, lo yehanush karet ela shayat tahor v'shelo yabederach v'cholka. It sounds like maybe only those 2 individuals get karet, if you're tahor or if you're b'derach v'cholka. Arel v'tamesheretz v'shar kol etzmei minayin. Where do you get that in Arel and it's mesheretz? And those people also were going to get karet if they didn't purify themselves in time. Talmud lomar v'ha'ish. Because it says v'ha'ish and not just ish, but it adds and it includes more people. So mikidikamahat now. What are we going to say from this? Midikamahadar atame, the fact that it's specifically talked about atme sheret and added him and said, well, it wasn't obvious he was going to be included, but in the end we include him, but we have to explain why we include him. Kasavar, it must be, this source holds, ein shochatim b'zorkin atme sheret, which would mean that it goes with what Rabba claimed Rabbi Eliezer holds, which is, it must be that you can't slaughter the Korban Pesach for atme sheret, because if you could, he'd be no different. If you say this person can be part of your Korban Pesach even if he hasn't purified himself, then what would you say? Then you'd say the Tmei Sheretz is no different from a regular Tahor person, and you wouldn't need a special pasuk to say, well, he gets karet, because if you can slaughter the Pesach for him and yet he doesn't do it, obviously he's going to get karet. He's like a regular person that you can slaughter the Pesach for and doesn't do it. So the fact that they exclude him from the rule and have to say, how do we know he's included, and specifically come up with a special drasha, means that ein shochatim v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. Okay, so I'll read it inside now, because if you could, he'd basically be just like a Torah person, he'd be no different. So therefore, in this case, we have a case of this Tana holds, like we said, that's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. Alma, and what do you see here though? Even though he's now Ra'oi, he has a chiyuva alei. He's going to get karet. What was the whole theory there? You're not going to get karet. if you don't, right? And that's why we don't allow you to sprinkle the water. So now, right, here it says he has a chiyuv on him. And even though it's not betzibor, the tzibor wouldn't need to purify themselves. This yachid does need to purify himself, because if he doesn't, he's going to get carried according to this source. So therefore, what do you see? Rabbi Eliezer, this doesn't fit with what we just said Rabbi Eliezer holds. So we're still stuck with why doesn't if he was going to get carried, then the haza'ah should override Shabbat according to Rabbi Eliezer theory that machshirei mitzvah dochim et Shabbat. You can't say he's not ra'oi. He is ra'oi to do the korban pesach, because you can, right? So basically, this doesn't work. So we're back to square one, which is, why does Rabbi Eliezer not allow haza'ah if he allows all sorts of other things? Ela amarava kasavar Rabbi Eliezer shochatim v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. It must be you misunderstood Rabbi Eliezer. He does hold, not like Rabba said. He holds shochatim v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. He is ra'oi to bring the korban. V'hu adin l'tmei mei b'shvi shelo, not just to tumat sheretz, also someone who's on the seventh day and needs sprinkling. You can't do the korban pesach for them. So then back to our question. If you can, why are you not allowed to sprinkle the waters on them? Oh, well, that's because you can slaughter the korban pesach for them even if they haven't sprinkled the water, which means that they can be part of the korban pesach even without that, which means you don't need it. Okay? You don't need the sprinkling in order to fulfill the mitzvah of the korban pesach. But wait a minute, what do you need the sprinkling for? To eat it at night. Remember, we said it's very important to eat the pesach at night. Well, now they say, so haza'alamai, so what does he need the sprinkling for? Not to do the korban. And it's, right? We thought he needed the sprinkling to allow him to be part of the korban pesach. No, you can be part of the korban pesach even without the sprinkling. What do you need the sprinkling for? La'achila, in order to eat it at night. And what are they telling you now? Achila psach and lo ma'akva. It's not ma'akev. In other words, you can fulfill the korban pesach. It's true, you're supposed to eat it. But if you don't eat it, it's fine. At least you did the korban pesach. So now what happens? You're on your seventh day. You can have people slaughter the pesach for you. You can't go to the temple because you're tamei, but you have people do it for you. You don't eat it that night because you didn't sprinkle, right? Because you can't sprinkle because it's Shabbat. That's why we don't allow you to sprinkle, because you basically go ahead and do it a little bit differently. You can't eat it, but okay, so you don't eat it, but you can have someone do the korban pesach. And therefore, if you don't do it, and even if you didn't sprinkle, if you don't do it, you're going to get carried. Okay, so that's how they explain this in the end, which then there's no question from the RL, because it's then the same as the RL, and that you don't even need that whole thing that Rabbi tried to explain earlier. So now, okay, we're at the very end of the difficult part of today's stuff. Then we can speed through the rest. Okay, this is actually already easy. But wait a minute. Didn't we just say that the Pesach then will be slaughtered shalol ochlav? We already learned you can't slaughter the Pesach for people who can't eat it. This person can't eat it because they didn't sprinkle the blood yet, the waters yet, the purification waters. So I keep confusing the sprinkling of the blood, the sacrifice. Right? They didn't sprinkle the waters on him. So those are two different things. There's number one, shalol ochlav means someone who physically can't eat. This person can physically eat. He just can't for halachic reasons because he didn't fix himself. So that's different. Okay. So we've answered that question. Now we want to go back to the Mishnah. We had Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer tried to say it overrides Shabbat. Rabbi Akiva said it doesn't override Shabbat. He says anything you could do from before doesn't override Shabbat. So now then we ended with this klal and Rabbi Akiva. Anything you could do from before Shabbat doesn't override Shabbat. Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav halakha ke Rabbi Akiva. We paskin like Rabbi Akiva. Utnanami gabe milah ki agavna. And as we said before, by Brit Milah it says the exact same thing. Even though Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, we hold like Rabbi Akiva that it doesn't override Shabbat. Klal amar Rabbi Akiva kom lacha she'efshar lasota me'erev Shabbat eina dochet haShabbat. Milah she'efshar lasota me'erev Shabbat dochet haShabbat. Right? The Brit Milah itself, you can't do it yesterday because it was only day number 7. It doesn't override Shabbat. But the machshirim, right? Anything you could have done, bringing the knife to the shul where you're going to do the Brit Milah, doesn't override Shabbat. And also there, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. So now the obvious question, why does he have to say it there and say it here? Aren't they the same? So tzricha, you need it. Now we're going to have to do why, if we said it in each case, you wouldn't say the same in the other. Utzricha. Pesach. Hatam mitzvah de lo dachish Shabbat mishum de lo nekretu alash 13 britot. There's something about Brit Milah. We've seen this before. The word Brit appears 13 times in the text there when Avram gets commanded. So we assume, there's like 13 covenants. This is super important. Therefore, you might have thought maybe we hold like Rabbi Eliezer specifically there if we only had it by Pesach. Right? So Pesach doesn't have that. You might not have needed it, whereas Brit Milah, we might say it overrides. And Yashmina Milah. So what if we said it by Brit Milah? And then you know if it doesn't override there, it certainly won't override Pesach. Well, no, because there's a Chumrah by Pesach that isn't by Brit Milah. You might have said Hatam hu doach shrei mitzvah lo dachu Shabbat deleka karet. Aval Pesach diika karet ema lidche tzricha. So you might have said there machshirei mitzvah don't override Shabbat there because there's no karet associated. Now there is karet with Brit Milah, but it doesn't kick in on day number 8. It kicks in if you don't do your Brit Milah when you turn 13 and you don't take care of it yourself. Okay, if your father didn't take care of it for you, then you're responsible. But it doesn't kick in on day number 8. And therefore you might have thought it overrides. And that's why you needed both. Okay, very briefly, we'll do this next Mishnah. I'll go over it again in tomorrow's daf. When do you bring a korban chagiga? There was something called a chagigat yudala. We'll talk about a lot more in tomorrow's daf that you would bring together with the korban pesach on the 14th. Chagiga is a type of shlamim that the owners eat. Bizman shiba bechol b'tara b'muat. Comes under 3 conditions. If your dalit falls on a weekday, if the community is all to'orim and not that the majority are tme'im and it's overridden, and b'muat, when you don't have enough meat, because this was meant to have more meat to supplement the korban pesach, which we'll see tomorrow why that is. Ubizman shuba b'shabbat b'meruba b'tuma ein mevi'im mo chagiga. So these are the opposite of those 3. If it's Shabbat, if it's there's a lot of meat, notice the order is different. I won't get into that, but talks about the quantity of the meat second here. In the first part, it talked about third, and betuma, and if people are impure. These are 3 differences between the korban chagiga and the korban pesach. Korban pesach was only brought from the sheep family, right, the lambs and the goats, whereas this could be brought also from the cattle. Korban pesach was only brought male. This could be male or female. Korban Pesach was only eaten for that night, and this is eaten for 2 days and the night in between. And another difference we'll see in the Gemara is Pesach has to be within the first year of the animal, and this could be even if the animal's older. So all these differences, tomorrow you'll see that this Mishnah only goes with one opinion. There's another opinion that says the Chagiga has to be exactly like the Pesach. But that will finish our complicated daf for today. Shabbat shalom to everybody.